Hey Unwrappers, before we start the show, I want to let you know about The Week magazine. It's the perfect news source for open-minded readers. More than 300,000 people enjoy The Week's concise and witty digest of news, along with the best in entertainment, art, food, and much more. And our summer sale is the perfect time to try it out. You can enjoy your first 6 issues absolutely free, along with a stylish picnic blanket. The sale ends on the 10th of August, so to start your free trial now, go to theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code SUMMER. That's theweek.co.uk/offer with promo code SUMMER. Now, on with the show. It's the week ending Saturday the 31st of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Taliban continuing their advance across Afghanistan, North and South Korea restoring a critical communications hotline, and Team GB diver Tom Daley and his partner Matty Lee winning gold at the Tokyo Olympics. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Arian McNichol. Let's unwrap the week. And Olly is still on holiday, so I'm here to unwrap another week with you, and joining me today from The Week Junior is editor Felicity Capon, plus freelancers Suchandrika, Chakrabarti and Abdulwahab Tahhan. And Suchandrika, you're starting us this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The future might look watery, but don't worry.
Fierce floods sweep through Germany with catastrophic consequences. Rivers burst their banks after relentless rains. Water races down small town roads, inundating entire areas.
Dozens of people have died, including 2 firefighters. Many more are missing. Hundreds of thousands of homes are without power. Helicopter crews have lifted stranded villagers to safety.
Deutsche Welle reporting on the extreme flooding in Germany this month. Suchandrika, what's your story?
So what we've had in the news this week and the last few weeks has been the flooding in cities like London, in New York, in Europe, flooding all over the world, and how cities are dealing with it. There's been lots of compelling footage of tube stations underwater, and I haven't been able to stop clicking. But I feel beyond that, that's been the main reporter story. Beyond that, there's how do we live in cities that are increasingly vulnerable to flash flooding? Do we have any solutions? And it does feel like there are some people writing about the solutions, but obviously the main story of, look at this footage, look at all these things happening, that sort of gets the attention, and then people move on to the next story. But I really want to look at, what can we do to live under these circumstances?
So I suppose before we get to the solutions, it's worth asking the question, what's causing all this flash flooding in the first place?
So it looks like climate change is very much to blame, and we are experiencing some of the effects of it. So somewhere like London, I'll take that as an example because I know that best and this is where I live. This is a very temperate climate. I remember growing up in the 80s and 90s, there was snow every year in December. You could see spring, summer, autumn happening. They felt different. Now you can get snow in May. We had a heat wave this week, and that's usually followed by a tropical thunderstorm, essentially. But London is not a tropical place. It's a paved over city. And when that water comes down in half an hour, that could serve for 5 days, it will run into the sewers, it will fill up the sewers, run back out, run into people's homes and workplaces, and cause a lot of damage and a lot of pain.
Yeah, I mean, Abdul, we've seen a lot of the photos and videos of these extreme floods that are happening in the places that Suchandrika is talking about, in Germany, Belgium, in China as well, and in London, as she was saying. Clearly places that aren't built to cope with these sorts of extremes of temperature. Are we just going to have to learn to live with this, or are there things we can do to change our cities to cope with it?
It is very strange to see all these floodings in the metro stations, even though some of them, like in the ones in China, they have been built just 10 years ago. So clearly this is not something that they have expected, and they didn't put anything in place. But from now on, I think before I go to a tube station here, even though I live in Hong Kong, very close to the sea, before I go to the tube station, I make sure that I have enough water and food, and I put on my swimming suit and go there, because you never know when you're kind of swimming into a puddle or whatever. But it is very, very strange. But I think here, what happens here in Hong Kong is that every time there's kind of a heavy rain, especially now we're in summer, this is the season for the rain, is that there are warnings. There are, warnings in a day before. So you kind of anticipate. So I was wondering if there's any warnings for people living in London, because I remember when I was living in London, I don't remember seeing any warnings that there's kind of flash floods in certain places.
No, I agree. And I've just recently moved out, but I lived in London for about 15 years. And I think part of the problem is in that whole time, I'd never even seen flash floods. So I don't think that the city's set up to have, emergency warnings. Felicity and Suchandrika, who still are living in London, did you get any sort of advance warning before the floods hit?
I mean, the Met Office does issue, it has issued over the summer. We had a severe heat warning, didn't we, for the first time ever, I think. And I'm sure there were warnings from the Met Office. Whether we knew how severe it would be and whether they were kind of communicated effectively to everyone is a different matter. I think one of the legacies of lockdown is that I feel I've become a lot better at checking the weather forecast, because we're at a time when your social activities really depended on what the weather was going to be. You'd always just sort of be looking up to see what the forecast was going to be. So I was aware that there were going to be thunderstorms on Sunday, but I still very blithely and naively set out to an outdoor bar, and luckily it was covered, and then suddenly the heavens started opening and I was like, blimey. I can't remember seeing anything so dramatic for such a long time.
But Abdul, I suppose you're talking about push notifications directly to your phone. Is that what you receive in Hong Kong?
It is push notification, and it's very, very common. And people here are kind of trained, and they know what's it like to be when the weather hits and there's a lot of rain. So, for example, when I first arrived in here, and people were talking about T2 typhoon, it was like, what is T2 typhoon? And people were telling me, all right, there are kind of 4 stages or 4 different types of typhoon: T1, 3, I think 8 and 10. When there's 8, you cannot really go or leave, and you should kind of tape your windows and make sure that they don't break, because it's very, very strong wind. And so the people know and understand, and there's this observatory here that sends push notifications, and you see all the people taking precautions. You see a lot of sandbags on the floor at the entrance of tube stations. So they're here prepared, because they know this happens a lot, many times during the year. But when I was living in London, I remember I see the kind of floods every year, not every year, every 2 or 3 years. And I wonder, is there any sandbag around in this country?
Before we think about that sort of immediate response that you might get with, early warning systems, do we need to be thinking about more long-term solutions that get us there quicker? So, Chandrika, cities that are built to withstand hurricanes have, houses constructed to resist strong wind and heavy rain. Will we need to think about how we design buildings in the UK to accommodate this sort of flash flooding?
Yeah, so an example is in New Orleans, which suffered through Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And so because of that huge disaster, which affected so many people, it was a huge political issue as well, that a lot of work has gone into trying to change how that city's infrastructure works in order, I think, really to work with the water cycle, which is really what the resilience work around flooding is, that cities can't ignore the fact that they're usually built near rivers, traditionally, because we need water, but at the same time we need to be able to manage when that water comes down in absolute inundation. We need to make sure that our systems and our infrastructure can deal with that. So something that New Orleans has done, they've got a whole system of urban development, which has been going on since 2005. For instance, in the Lakeview neighbourhood, the street system has been re-engineered to use all of the alleyways as green infrastructure. So they've got permeable paving, which means that rather than the water running off the pavement, as it does generally in London and in other paved cities, which then goes into the sewers and the sewer levels rise and spill back out, the rain can go through the pavement and get to basically the soil which is underneath, and then the soil can absorb that. So you're really looking at ways in which to let the natural world still coexist with our concreted world, like green roofs and so on, like having green spaces, having something that they have in Victoria Park in Sydney is kind of places that look like empty pools in squares where people can meet, but when it rains that hard, those pools fill up and they keep the water away from people's workspaces, from the pavement where people are walking, from people's homes. So you can make water features as well. You can have almost a little bit of fun with it, but you need to plan 15 years ahead, 20 years ahead, and think about, well, how can we just keep this away from where people actually live and make it into something that can be reusable as well, and something that can stay in place and take runoff water for decades, maybe centuries to come.
These also don't sound like cheap solutions, and we've been talking so far at least about, how we can adjust our response in the developed world. But what about countries that aren't quite as wealthy as, say, Australia or the UK? Felicity, how will they cope with increases in flooding?
Well, I mean, I think we're already seeing the climate crisis having an effect on places in the world which are just going to become rapidly uninhabitable. And I think you're going to see climate refugees, which I don't think is a term that's sort of been officially coined within the kind of refugee terminology yet, but I think you're seeing more people on the move. I think it's harder to sort of always directly trace it back to climate crisis, but I think it must be the fact that more people, more parts of the world, you just won't be able to live there. And I think, unfortunately, it will be places where there's already political instability and fewer resources, and so people will just move. I think that's one of the scenarios that's already put in place, really.
So, Suchandrika, how will this impact businesses?
Well, I suppose you have businesses like, for example, Google, when it opens up a new building, particularly in London, they have a kind of green element. They have these promises they make. They do have terraces and they have green roofs and things like that. You need to have bins to take rainwater in and make it safe for drinking water. So a big company like Google, these international companies, they can afford to rent or buy those properties and install all of these green additions. But, the smaller companies, the places that run out of people's homes, it's going to be much harder to do that kind of thing. And we really need to look at, is our government going to be putting lots more money into flood defences, which they are, but can some of that money go into kind of making our cities and our homes water resilient? Is that a term they're happy to look into? Is that something that we could think about in the future? Because at the moment it's really falling on insurance, and it's like the damage is done already, and then it's very much individual responsibility, and if your insurance will pay. And it seems like a very incredibly stressful way to deal with something that's a worldwide phenomenon and that everyone shares the ill effects of and the responsibility for.
Felicity, there have been some reports this week suggesting that the UK is likely to be one of the few places that would survive a potential collapse of global civilization, as dramatic as that sounds. Why is that exactly, and how likely is that scenario?
Yeah, so they've listed 5 places that have come out on top in this very grim sounding study. So New Zealand, Iceland, the UK, Tasmania and Ireland have all done very, very well. And that's partly because they're all islands or island continents. They've got fewer extremes in temperature. And that means that there's varied amounts of rainfall. I mean, you wouldn't believe it looking at some of the flooding in the UK, but compared to other places, due to their proximity to oceans, the amount of rainfall is more manageable. I suppose also being islands, they've got natural borders, so they can pull up the drawbridge to big migrations of people who are moving for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Although I suppose other people would say at the moment there seem to be lots of people crossing the channel at the moment, so I'm not sure how true that is either. But it's also with, I think, New Zealand and the UK sort of similar climates in terms of agriculture, the ability to be self-sufficient and look after yourself in relation to your population. So the UK has come out strongly. And then I suppose, I think we've talked about New Zealand before on this podcast, and the idea that billionaires famously have always seen New Zealand as the place where they want to build their bolt holes in their pads so that when Armageddon strikes, that's the place to go to. I think New Zealand is seen famously as the one that is most robust against impending doom and collapse and catastrophe. I think in the report, the reasons why they wanted to carry this out is that I think one of the scientists, he said, we've just seen a pandemic, we've seen a financial crisis in the last 2 decades, we've seen food shortages. If all of those things happened at the same time, it's not a totally wild scenario that there could be serious collapse on the horizon, but at the other, there was a more hopeful note was struck that the ability of governments to act quickly and for there to be sort of international collaboration could be a sign of hope that governments could work on a global scale to sort of mitigate impending doom.
It's one of those stories that even if you were one of the countries that made the top 5 of the list, it's still not a happy place to be. We're still talking about the collapse of global civilization. So, Suchandrika, what's next for this story? Is it going to just continue getting worse, or are we likely to see solutions put in place that are going to avert that kind of disaster that Felicity is just talking about?
So in terms of the weather, it does seem to be getting worse. There's a State of the UK Climate 2020 report published by the International Journal of Climatology, and they said that last year was the first year to figure in the top 10 for heat, rain and hours of sunshine in records going back more than a century. So British weather is becoming much less moderate. It's going much more to those extremes. And so it does seem to be a pattern that is happening. But, look at cities like Rotterdam. That's an incredibly watery city. They have done a lot of work in terms of trying to make that city livable and indeed pleasurable to live in as well. So they say, you can't design out flooding. The natural world is there and cities are built by water. But what you can do is just make sure the water is rerouted when it comes down in a thunderstorm that lasts for half an hour but gives you 5 days water. You can make sure that water is not running into people's homes as the first stop. I mean, it could still happen. You can't always insure against flooding in the home, but you can make sure it first goes to these green roofs, these open spaces, these containers for recycling water. And it's about working together with planners, with governments, and making sure the money goes towards changing these cities to work with this new kind of climate we're going to be dealing with.
Well, after that slight deluge of information, Abdul, I'm coming to you next, after this. Okay, Abdul, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
11 years on and the Arab Spring hasn't sprung.
This conflict will lead to blood flowing. People are hitting and hurting each other. It's come to violence, but why? People took to the streets to celebrate when the news broke. Many are furious about the actions of their politicians. Protesters point to the worsening COVID-19 situation and the country's deepening economic woes. President Kais Saied met with protesters on the streets, and in a televised address he said the move was completely legal. And in accordance with Article 80 of the Constitution, he could suspend Parliament.
Stefan Schaff reporting for Deutsche Welle earlier this week. Abdul, what's the story?
So earlier this week, the president of Tunisia decided to dismiss the parliament and the prime minister of Tunisia and decided to take all the judicial and executive power into his own hands. And in that clip that you just played, he did not really meet the protesters on the streets. He met with his supporters who were so happy that they've got another dictator running in the Arab world, as if we are short of dictators. And the President Said, decided to dismiss a large number of senior officials, including the head of the national TV, which is seen as a very important part to make sure that he's got all the support. Police and the military raided some media offices, including Al Jazeera office, which is the largest media organization in the Arab world. So this is really huge. So this might not be huge for people living in Europe, but this is huge for Arabs because this is the place where the Arab Spring started back in 2010. This is a place where it had fairly fair and open and free elections, and it looked like, democracy is taking place in there. So to see this person, President Said, becoming another dictator is really upsetting to a lot of Syrians and a lot of Arabs in the region.
Yeah, Felicity, that overthrow of Ben Ali 11 years ago really did look like a moment where we were going to get some hope, if not necessarily across the entire region, at least in Tunisia. And I think the story has been of its progress democratically. But it hasn't all been a rosy story, has it?
No, it hasn't really. I mean, the roots of the Arab Spring can be traced back to Tunisia. It was in 2010 when a fruit seller called Mohamed Bouazizi, he set himself on fire in protest against police who'd confiscated his goods. And footage of this self-immolation spread across the country and people took to the streets. And I mean, it all happened very quickly. Within a month, protests had forced Ben Ali to flee to Saudi Arabia, and then the protests caught on across the region. And it felt like such a, it was a story that sort of gripped the whole world, and it felt like such a turning point. By 2014, Tunisia had adopted a new enlightened constitution. It held parliamentary and presidential polls. I remember The Economist had named it its country of the year. I think in the West particularly, there was a lot of hope and jubilation. And maybe too much sort of burden was placed on the shoulders of this country in a very, very kind of nascent democracy that was emerging, very, very fragile. And I mean, that was a successful revolution compared to other countries in the region, the Arab Spring, look at Syria, for example. But then recently in Tunisia, I think a lot of Tunisians would look at the West's idea of Tunisia being this beacon of hope and sort of say that was completely mad, because there's been huge protests over mass unemployment. They consider parliament to be inefficient and stagnant. They've had 10 governments in 10 years. Unemployment is hovering at about 16%, I think. Living costs have increased. It's not, a lot of people are very, very unhappy, which is why you've got the protests that we're seeing now.
I suppose the question is, Suchandrika, was life better, and this must be what the everyday Tunisian is asking him or herself, was life better under Ben Ali than it has been under this fledgling democracy? And I suppose now that we're seeing these moves by Kais Saied, is it going to be better to return to something like the authoritarianism that had existed prior to this democratic experiment? What do you think it is? Is it one or the other?
I think it must be a mixture of many things. So I saw that Saied was described in The Guardian as a dour law professor, which is a great way of not saying dictator, I suppose. But it also shows us that he understands the Constitution probably at a level that many of his other members of Parliament don't, or don't read to the detail of. So he understands how to hold up Parliament, how to hold off increasing democratic rights. So, for instance, he's been locked in a struggle with Tunisia's Parliament, the Ennahda party, and he's made sure that the country's post-revolution separation of powers between the president and the prime minister hasn't actually happened. So I think that democracy generally, it does depend on a good economy. And beyond that, it's very fragile because it's open, because everyone should be able to take part. It does mean that someone who understands his country's constitution and laws can take that law into his own hands before people realise he's doing that, because he knows he can work within the law. And it does seem like something like that's happened here. It takes one person to go, actually, democracy seems okay, but I know I can take this for myself. And beyond that, if there has been 16% unemployment, I mean, that's going to create dissatisfaction with the young people. And Saied has been really popular with the young people because he's actually been socially a bit more progressive than the rest of his government or the other parties. And also, those young people were children when the Arab Spring happened. So if they did live under an authoritarian regime, they don't necessarily remember its stories their parents told them. So now they're expecting something different and they're possibly not getting it from him. But I think more than anything else, what's really possibly shattering their very fragile democracy is the fact that their jobs probably take place out of the home. They probably don't have as much kind of the white-collar informational worker jobs that we have, we can do on our laptops. And in a country that still only has 7% of its population vaccinated against COVID, they've had an incredibly tough year and a half. People have had to go out of the house to make any kind of money. And if they hadn't, they've been facing an increasingly desperate situation. A lot of the protests have been around the fact that they think their government has not rolled out the vaccine well and has not dealt with the pandemic well. So I think the pandemic has been the straw that's broken the back of this particular fragile democracy.
Yeah, Abdul, a lot of publications over in the UK at least are being hesitant to use the word coup too straightforwardly, but parliamentarians in Tunisia are using that word. Is this a coup, do you think?
It is definitely a coup in a new term or different term. And this is very dangerous if the whole world doesn't set a precedent here and say, hey, no, this is a coup. We cannot deal with the new president because of what he's done. And this reminds me of what happened in Egypt. So in Egypt, after overthrowing Mubarak, it was a huge, big thing for us in Syria that when we saw it and we were so hopeful that we were going to do the same things. A couple of years later, they had elections, free elections, and then Morsi won the elections. He was the candidate of the Muslim Brotherhood, but he won the elections fair and square. And then after a year, there was a military coup against him. The leader of the army became the president, put Morsi in prison, and Morsi died in prison due to health issues. But everything went back to normal. So the new president of Egypt, the leader of the army, became the elected president, and he met with all the presidents of the world, and it was all normal. So if we don't hold those in power to account, if we don't call it what it is, this sets really a big precedent. And there is one thing that If the protesters are protesting against the government and asking for the government to resign, and then the government decides to resign, is one thing, and it's another when the president himself decides, no, I'm going to take everything into my own hands and put a curfew in place for a month. So now there's a curfew from 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. every month, and the government organization are all shut every Tuesday and Wednesday as well. So he's not only carrying a coup, but he's doing an unprecedented thing, a curfew.
Do you think, Felicity, this is the sort of thing that will be able to be repelled? Obviously, it's a fast-moving story, so it's hard to know where it's going to be even next week. But do you think, from what we've seen so far, that Sayed is likely to be successful in this power grab, or do you think that it's going to fall apart at some stage?
Well, I mean, I guess the whole 10 governments in 10 years suggests to me that it will be fast moving and people are going to come and go. Unfortunately, I don't see much stability and security on the horizon, which is obviously a real shame and a real reversal of how people thought this story was going to play out. I wonder whether it's partly to do with the COVID pandemic reigniting an allure for the strongman. You know, we have parliamentary democracy right now, but look at us. There's last year 1/3 of households in Tunisia feared running out of food. I think there was chaos with the vaccine rollout, people turning up to vaccination centres and there not being enough there and all that sort of thing. So I think people are so thoroughly fed up, and I wonder whether they're sort of harping back to this time, reimagining a time before the pandemic and before the Arab Spring, when actually you would settle for a strong man just to actually take control and get on with it. I mean, I suppose the problem with authoritarian dictators is that once they get stuck in, they really do hang around for quite a long time, and they're extremely hard to get rid of, and they use force and suppression and all sorts of horrible tactics. So maybe he will last, but if he does, I don't think that will be a good result for Tunisia or the region or the rest of the world, really.
I suppose the world looked at the situation under the Arab Spring and saw it as a kind of domino effect, that it began in one country and that other countries were then inspired to do something similar to overthrow their authoritarian leaders. Abdul, do you think that the countries around Tunisia and countries in a similar situation will see the snuffing out of this one country's offering of some kind of hopefulness as being impactful on their own desire to continue their own fight for political change in their country?
I think those countries who didn't react immediately to the Arab Spring are not going to react at all. Like we got Jordan, for example, or Morocco or Algeria. You know, nothing happened there, and so they're not going to suddenly now decide to take it to the streets. They're going to say, okay, look at Syria. This is the phrase that everyone says, we don't want another Syria. We don't want another Syria. So everyone is like, Syria is not the boogeyman where everyone refers to it. So like, okay, it's better to have a stable place. I don't want to become a refugee, having to travel, having to leave my country and having, I don't know, to live in a camp. So it's better to live in a place where, you know, the living conditions are not really good than take it to the street and protest. And taking it to the street doesn't really guarantee any change. Look at what's happening in Lebanon. In Lebanon, the local currency lost 90% of its value. They don't have medicine. They don't have oil. They don't have a government now because the head of the government stepped down. And the situation is getting worse and worse. So, but what I see is that Tunisia was kind of thing that we have never imagined would take place. And we pretty much Syrians looked up to Tunisia. So now a lot of Syrians were really disappointed, and you know, it brought us some bad memories of what we were living like, what's being like living under a dictatorship.
Well, Felicity, you're up next after this. All right, Felicity, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week that endurance running really went off the beaten track?
It is absolutely amazing what the human body can do, but it's even more amazing what our mind can make us do. During 100 miles, your body physically it breaks down, and you really have to rely on your mental state to get you through. Something in 100 miles as little as a one negative thought can really ruin your day. Just saying, oh, I feel awful, this is awful, I can't do this. And that keeps going through your mind mile after mile. It's going to be tough to finish that 100 miles.
Oh my god, that does not sound like fun. A trailer for the ultramarathon documentary 100 Head, Heart, Feet, released back in 2013. Felicity, what's your story?
So a new ultramarathon race is being launched in Scotland. It's called the Highland Kings Ultra, and it's a 4-day camping race covering 120 miles on the west coast of Scotland. But unlike other horrendous sounding ultramarathons, this one has a little bit of a twist in that it not only will cost you just under £16,000 to enter, but it's also it's also being billed as the most exclusive luxury ultra run experience on the planet. So some of the perks of this incredible sounding race include butlers, you have your own butler, hydrotherapy pools, speedboats, and Michelin star chefs. I think there's also sort of celebrity endurance athletes who will be at the end of this thing for a big like gala dinner. The whole thing sounds completely mad.
I mean, yes to all of that kind of thing, but you still have to do some pretty serious running around the Michelin-starred luxury, right? You
do. So I think it's split into 3 legs, and each one is sort of averaging around 30 miles. And this is Scotland's west coast, so it's not for the faint-hearted. I mean, the way that the race director is talking about it, she said the idea was for the runners to race like a warrior but recover like a king. So it's the idea that it's still going to be pretty hardcore, but they also want to put more of a focus and emphasis on recovery and well-being. And I suppose that's quite a pertinent topic at the moment. We've got the Olympics going on. We've seen Simone Biles crash out due to her mental health. And, you know, is this more the time when we think about sport in terms of not just your physical endurance, but what's going on in your head? And would a luxury race go some way to help you?
I mean, Suchandrika, does all of this luxury take the fun out of it? I mean, I thought ultra marathons were meant to be grueling. That's kind of baked into what an ultra marathon is all about. Isn't that part of the challenge?
I guess we have to think about the demographics of who can afford this kind of thing. So it's was about 15-16 grand. So I'm in that category. No, I'm not. We're thinking like CEOs, massive companies, probably older men. I'm imagining so these guys, they're going to get injuries. They need to know they're going to be looked after and not left on a Scottish hill and waiting to see what the waves do with them. So they actually need that kind of care afterwards. And so what they get, I suppose, is a kind of illusion of conquering nature and optimizing their own bodies and pushing themselves physically. And then also that the video we played at the start, they said something about your mind will just like go off somewhere, and it sounds like a drug almost. So it's like pushing your mind to its absolute limits, but at the same time, if you get a sprained ankle, you're good and dinner will be lovely. So it's kind of like that pushing, but it's for someone who understands that actually at the bottom of it all, they are not immortal or certainly impervious to the odd sprain.
Abdul, you don't look terribly impressed by all of this. What's your take on it?
No, I'm not, because I am a runner myself. I've run a marathon. I run half marathons regularly. But I've never heard of a butler at any race. So I was wondering, is the butler going to carry you? Are they going to put you on your shoulders and run? The feed station, is it run by Michelin star? So when they give you a banana, for example, or gummy bear, is it prepared by a Michelin star chef? I was really wondering, because when you're running, you do it for the grind. You do it because you want to get into the mud. You want to get into challenging circumstances, and especially running in England. You live in England. Have you seen the weather in England? It's not ideal for running at all. You know, people run, sometimes it's too hot, sometimes too cold. I remember running my marathon, I was wearing 2 layers and a hat. Nobody runs in a hat. I didn't even sweat because I was shivering. I was so cold. So to do all of that and then end up going to attend a gala after your marathon, when you just want to have a massage and just sleep, and then you have to wake up next day. So I really wonder, how can you wake up to run another 40 miles when you're sleeping in silk and you have, I don't know, a open buffet breakfast? It's really difficult. I don't see it.
I mean, are these things about, Felicity, sport and sporting achievement? Is this meant to appeal to people who are real athletes? Or is this a statement about how people want to spend their money when they have an awful lot of money?
I think it must be the latter. I don't think this can be I certainly don't think you get bragging rights or any glory if you're going to do this race. I mean, I think if you really want to test yourself but still have that safety blanket and that comfort, then this will be for you. But I mean, I wouldn't be remotely impressed if someone came up to me and said they'd done this. So I think this must be a lifestyle choice about what you want to spend your money on. And I guess the idea of being in a kind of breathtakingly beautiful wilderness like Scotland, which does have the potential to be dangerous, but knowing all at the same time that you're safe, that must be the draw. And I mean, there are sort of ultra marathons that have obviously taken it too far and ended in absolute disaster and tragedy. I mean, early this year there was the story in China of the 21 ultramarathon runners who died from hypothermia taking part in a 60-mile ultramarathon in Gansu province, and they were hit by, I think, high winds and freezing rains, and there wasn't enough. So I mean that's the other extreme. And I think this week you also had Rick Allen, who was a Scottish climber who has died on K2 in an avalanche. And I mean, so these things are dangerous, potentially, life-threatening. And so I can kind of slightly understand the desire to take the slightly more luxurious route.
I mean, I suppose that's an important point, isn't it, Suchandrika, that, there are real risks associated with these sorts of competitions. I mean, is this the sort of thing that is just for the elite in sport, or could anyone get involved in this sort of competition?
Well, that's a worrying thing, isn't it? I think if this was for athletes, you'd hear words like nutritionist, physiotherapist, that kind of thing, like looking at the health of the body as well. But this, to me, like the more we discuss it, it feels like guerrilla marketing for the next season of Succession, and it makes me really, really want to watch that. I could see, like, maybe not Logan Roy himself, but maybe his sons, and it feels like you get bragging rights at Davos, right? So I missed out on like going up Everest this year because the conditions weren't great, but I managed to do this ultra marathon, and people do die on Everest on these guided trips. Like, it's incredibly dangerous, and some people can't push through the altitude sickness. Like, I've experienced altitude sickness, not at that level, but at Machu Picchu, and like it incapacitates you. You can't sleep, you can't do anything. And so it's about this endurance stuff that I feel possibly the ultra rich and the ultra marathons is about. Like, well, we have the same level of money, we have helicopters, we have all this stuff, but me personally, I'm going to live forever because look, I've got this level of endurance. It's for me, it's for the level below Jeff Bezos rocket level. Like, they can't afford the rocket, fine, but they can push their body to the limit and then say, well, what was your PB?
I mean, Felicity, why does this matter? Is this just a story of the lifestyles of the rich and famous, or is there something deeper going on here?
Partly the lifestyles of the rich and famous are always fun, and it's always fun to see where they're next going to put their money, and I guess whether this even takes off, I suppose, will be interesting to see. I think it also does speak to this growing trend of a slightly decadent, comfortable society. We'll do things, but only if we know it's safe and it's comfortable and all that sort of thing. And then I suppose the other thing is increasingly, I think what I find fascinating about this sort of endurance thing, and having watched the Olympics this week, is that, and as that guy was saying on the clip we just played, it is about conquering the mental side of things. You have to be able to sort of get in control of your mind in order to overcome these incredible feats of endurance that not at all, me at all, but some crazy humans will do. And I think increasingly the more we understand about mental health and well-being, and I think that in the role of sport is coming out more strong. You're seeing that people talking about that more often. So I just think it's an interesting story to see. It will be interesting to see where it goes in that direction, I think.
Well, we, at least, have made it to the finish line for another week. My thanks to Felicity, Suchandrika and Abdul for their stories. And remember, you can follow this show for free. No entry fee required. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Arian McNichol. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And Ollie will be back from his holidays to unwrap next week. So from me, for now, bye-bye.